What drives someone to become a religious extremist, even to the point of becoming a suicide bomber? Like most people, I assumed that there were two overriding answers: poverty and ignorance. The poverty line goes like this: grinding poverty from which there appears to be no escape fosters seething resentment against those who have more. If your choice is to die a martyr or die a beggar, martyrdom is the clear winner. The ignorance lines goes like this: the poor have no chance to get a decent education and thus are susceptible to easy manipulation. Clever people play on their prejudices and superstitions. Once the extremist gets this ignorant, poor person in his grasp, indoctrination is easy. Since there's plenty of poverty and plenty of ignorance around the world, that's a lot of people to draw from. This is how the source of terrorism is explained. Then I went to Pakistan and actually lived in the world from which extremists recruit, and I found something much different than I expected. Poverty had little to do with who became an extremist, lack of education even less. Many of those that I met who subscribe to religious extremism and are prepared to murder and die for their cause are from the middle class, and many had a university education. These are not poor people, and these are not uneducated people. They are well-fed and well-read. So if poverty and ignorance don't drive people to extremism, what does? One is a desire for meaning and for order. Places like Pakistan are submerged in chaos and corruption. Islamists promise clear-cut solutions to every problem. Here's how things will change if you follow these rules, and only these rules. Another is a desire for change. The old corrupt order, the narrative goes, must be overthrown, and that can only happen through violent action. Again, it is Islamists that step in with a promise to create a new form of government. Then throw in a strong sense of victimhood. We are not responsible for the sorry state of our country. Others have brought us down, and you have a toxic brew that many willingly imbibe. These, of course, are the same easy answers that tyrants and demagogues, from Lenin to Mussolini to Hitler to bin Laden, have always offered their followers. I saw this played out one day while living in Pakistan. After one of the many assassinations of a major figure there, I was sitting with two middle-class parents. The father owned a small business, and the mother was a nurse. They had given their son a good life. He wanted for nothing. They told me that during dinner with the family a few days earlier, their son noted how the person who was murdered deserved to die. Why? Because he had spoken out on behalf of religious minorities. They were shocked. How could their son, who'd been educated and well-raised, think that? This story is all too typical. So what to do about this extremism? The first step is to get off this false narrative that this is first and foremost a poverty or education issue. The second is to take on the narrative of the extremist groups. They promise a better way, but what in fact do they deliver? The answer is always more death, more suffering, and more poverty. In other words, young people need to see these extremist groups for what they are. Only then will recruiting numbers begin to go down. Third, the media have to stop treating extremists as freedom fighters, a narrative that is all too common in places like Pakistan. Fourth, teachers and parents cannot assume that just because they reject religious extremism, their children and students will too. Middle-class parents and teachers have to be vigilant in instilling moderate, pluralist values in their children. Fifth, politicians have to stop blaming their country's problems on the West and have to confront the endemic corruption that destroys countries like Pakistan from within. Sixth, and probably most important, Islamic religious figures have to stop looking the other way, or worse, glorifying so-called martyrs, Muslims who murder innocent people. Almost always other Muslims in the name of Islam. Muslim religious leaders must promise these murderers eternal damnation, not some sort of twisted heavenly bliss. The people of Pakistan and other Muslim-majority countries have real grievances, but extremism only makes things worse, always and everywhere. It's not poverty and misery that creates religious extremism, it is religious extremism that creates poverty and misery, and death. I'm Haroon Ullah, adjunct professor at the...
Like fascism and communism, Islamism is totalitarian in nature. The state controls everything. Also, like fascism and communism, Islamism is inherently expansionist. It always seeks to get bigger, cross borders, and bring as many peoples as possible under its control. And, like fascism and communism, many of Islamism's adherents are prepared to kill to achieve its aims. Those aims are antithetical to everything Western and other free societies stand for. Free speech, free enterprise, freedom to practice or not to practice any religion, freedom of assembly, a free press, and, of course, fundamental human and civil rights for all their citizens. Islamism completely rejects the Western principle of separating religion from government. In its view, governments are legitimate only if they rule according to religious law, in Islamism's case, Sharia, Islam's extensive body of sacred laws. Sharia is based on the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran is believed to be the literal words of Allah as revealed to his prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, and the Sunnah consists of the words and deeds attributed to Muhammad. Islamists interpret Sharia to hold that anyone born Muslim must remain Muslim and face execution if they convert to any other religion, that adulterers must be stoned to death, that anyone who insults Islam or Muhammad must either be severely whipped or executed, and that thieves should have a limb cut off. In addition, Islamists condone polygamy and child marriage. These beliefs are being put into practice right now in, among other places, Iran, the Sudan, Saudi Arabia, the Muslim parts of Nigeria, parts of Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and wherever else Sharia has established a foothold. If Islamists were, indeed, Islamists have killed far more Muslims than members of any other group. So how many Islamists are there? Nobody knows for sure, but we can make some conservative calculations. There are approximately 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. How many of these are Islamists? A 2013 Pew Research poll offers some clues. 86% of Muslims in Pakistan, 80% in Egypt, and 65% in Jordan support the stoning of adulterers. 79% in Afghanistan, 62% of Palestinians, and 58% in Malaysia, considered a moderate Muslim country, support the death penalty for Muslims who convert from Islam. If only 10% of the world's Muslims are Islamists, and the percentage is likely higher, that's 150 million people. Among these, how many are willing to take violent action to enforce their Islamism? Here we're talking about Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the Taliban, Hamas, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other groups that send suicide bombers into markets, explode car bombs at funerals, throw acid in the faces of girls who attend school, murder sisters or daughters who defy the will of a brother or father, or who fly hijacked airplanes into buildings. This is a very hard number to pin down. So let's again be cautious and say the figure is only 2% of that 150 million. That's still 3 million people, 3 million potential terrorists organized by a common ideology and supported by many more. The good news is that hundreds of millions of Muslims are not radical Islamists. Just to cite one example, since the beginning of the 20th century, every generation has been confronted with a lethal threat to freedom and fundamental human rights. Free people defeated the last two totalitarian threats, fascism and communism. If we want to preserve freedom, we, non-Muslims and Muslims alike, will have to defeat the threat of our time, Islamism. I'm Raymond Ibrahim, author of the Al-Qaeda Reader for Prager University.
الذين كفروا فضرب الرقاب وقتی که با کافر ملاقاتت حاصل شد فضرب الرقاب چی در کار است؟ بزنین در گردنشان حتی اذا اثخنتموهم تا که بکشین کسرت خونریزی بکنین فشد الوثاق محکم کنید قید و ولچک و زولانه را که نگریزن اسیرشه. کفاری که خود به نام دانشمندان مبصر و مفکر انتخاب میکنن عنوان میکنن اونا میگن اسلام بعضی نواقص خود داره نعوذ بالله من جمله نظام بردهداری. نظام بردهداری میگه در اسلام نقص است. چرا؟ از انسان غلام کنیز ساختن و این غلام و کنیز مانند مواشی در بازار فروختن. دها دست تبدیل میشه و این کنیز که دها دست تبدیل میشه 10 نفر جمع میکنه بعد از یک استبرا که یک حیض استبرا داره. پس این یک نوع ظلم است نعوذ بالله. سلب آزادی انسانیت است، سلب آزادی مفکوره انسان و الحاق انسانیت به مواشی و بهیمیت است. فلهذا این نقص اسلام است که نظام بردهداری و کنیزداری را در جهان اسلام عرضه کرده به عنوان یک جزیه دین تقدیم کرده. غلامان القبگوش اروپاییان و امریکاییان، اینا میگن که در عصر امروز نیست، در عصر امروز نیست، بس نیست، خلاص خدا خلاص کرد. در عصر امروز غلام و کنیز نیست، در حالی که این جرعه‌خوران دشمن، این القبگوش ها نمیدانند که دین تا روز قیامت کامل است. اینا بیچارگکا در اثر جرعه دشمن اینا خودش یهود شده، خودش یهود شده، حکم خدا را تغییر میده. خداوند متعال خودش رحم کنه به این فتواها. قطعا در دماغت بگی که نظام بردهداری تا قیامت ختم نمیشه. بعضی ها میگه غلامش چیست، کنیزش چیست. هرگاه مجاهدین با دنیای کفر و الحاد برزمن، ساحه را تسلط کنن، بعد تمام دار و ندار کافر غنیمت اینهاست. از سوزن شروع تا زن و فرزند و تمام زندگی غنیمت است. غنیمت که شد، پس بچه ها همه مردانه غلام میشوند، زنانه چی میشه؟ کنیز. تقسیم میشه بین مجاهدین. مال و دارایی و زمین و جایداد بارد چی میشه؟ تقسیم میشه. تا روز قیامت در اثر جنگ مجاهد و کفر و الحاد هر آنچی از کافر به دست مجاهد می افتد نامش غنیمت است. مال منقول و غیر منقول تقسیم میشه و انسانیت که به دستشان آمده اسیر شده، زنده اونا غلام و کنیز میشه. غلامش عیس استخدام، چی معنا؟ در خدمت ها استخدام کنه، عمل جنسی ممنوع است. اما کنیزش چیست؟ بدون نکاح به مولای خود حق لازمش است، مشروعش است که جما میکنه. هرگاه در بازار بفروشه به کسای دیگری، دست که در 10 سال تبدیل شوه، فقط اونمو یک حیز استبرا میشه که حمل نداشته باشه، بس دوباره چی میشه بگو؟ او به او جما میکنه به نکاح. به نکاح خودش هم کنیز شدن خودش یک نوع مشروعیت است. قرآن کریم در جزء 8 چی میگه؟ میگه که در جزء 18 نه، مگر کسایی که به زن و کنیز جما میکنن ملامت نیستن. درست است نه؟ به زن و کنیز، به زن به نکاح، به کنیز به ملک یمین میگوره. تا که حکومت عیسی علیه السلام نیاید تا اون وقت جهاد ادامه داره. تا زمانی که در سرزمین هیچ دین نماند جز از دینی که اسلام عزیز، کفر یکسره دامنش چیده شود.
Just when you thought ISIS couldn't get any worse, they have put out guidelines for how to rape your sex slaves. Now, they put these out a while back in January. It's not just the U.S. saying this. In fact, the United Nations and human rights groups have accused the Islamic State of systematic abduction and rape of thousands of women and girls as young as 12. Now, I give you that backup just because the story is so unbelievable that you think, like, really, could this possibly be true? But yes, the UN, human rights groups, the US, everyone who's looked at it, the media, agrees. So they explain that Islamic State theologians have issued an extremely detailed ruling on when owners of women enslaved by the extremist group can have sex with them in an apparent bid to curb what they called violations in the treatment of captured females. So understand why they put this fatwa out in the first place. It's very specific, fatwa number 64. Because not only were they taking sex slaves and raping them, but they were apparently committing violations within the rape. I don't even want to know what those violations are. So they had to put out this edict saying, hey, rape your sex slaves right. That's I told you it was unbelievable, right? So let me give you more details to show you how grotesque it is. Reuters explains, and they got to look at the documents, among the religious rulings are bans on a father and a son having sex with the same female slave, and the owner of a mother and a daughter having sex with both. Joint owners of a female captive are similarly enjoined from intercourse because she's viewed as part of a joint ownership. So, I mean, if you own the same sex slave, you got to have rules, right? I mean, who's going to have sex, when, etc. Can a dad and a son have sex with the same female slave. When you got to clarify this, I think you might be in a world of disaster, and that's exactly where ISIS is. Now, on Fatwa 64, there's direct quotes here. They explain, if the owner of a female captive who has a daughter suitable for intercourse has sexual relations with the latter, he is not permitted to have intercourse with her mother, and she's permanently off limits to him. Should he have intercourse with her mother, then he is not permitted to have intercourse with her daughter, and she is to be off limits to him. Basically, they're saying, like, are we not reasonable here? I mean, come on.
Hardly a day goes by in which the Islamic State, also known as ISIS or ISIL, doesn't appear in a newspaper or on a TV news screen. And the news is always bad. Hideous death and wanton destruction of a type rarely seen in modern history. So what is the Islamic State? Where did it come from? What does it want? And why?
The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria is a phenomenon so terrible and shocking it seems impossible. It controls an area the size of the United Kingdom, commits mass atrocities, and launches terror attacks abroad. But to understand ISIS, it helps to tell the story of its rise. And that story begins far away and many years before the group existed. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to defend a puppet dictator against rebels. Young men from the Middle East flock in to join the rebels. Many see it as a religious struggle, and some develop extremist views. Among them is a well-educated young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Also in Afghanistan is a semi-literate former street thug from Jordan, calls himself Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They do not get along and never will, but will create the groups we today know as Al-Qaeda and as ISIS. The Soviets withdraw in 1989, and the Arab fighters eventually go home. Bin Laden grows Al-Qaeda into a global network to continue the struggle against Islam's enemies. Zarqawi forms his own group, but it fizzles. Both men later return to Afghanistan, now ruled by the Taliban. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacks America from its base there. The U.S. invades Afghanistan. Bin Laden flees to Pakistan. Zarqawi, still obscure, flees to a remote and lawless corner of Iraq. 2 years later, the U.S. does something that will transform the Middle East and set the stage for ISIS.
My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome.
The Americans topple Saddam Hussein's secular, mostly Sunni dictatorship, and it disbands the Iraqi army. Thousands of Sunni Iraqi soldiers, angry and unemployed, join the insurgency. Jihadist groups, who are also Sunni, see this as a repeat of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and again they flood in to fight. Zarqawi is among them. Zarqawi's group eventually becomes Iraq's most ruthless. He especially attacks Shia, deliberately sparking a Sunni-Shia civil war. By 2004, Zarqawi is a jihadist superstar. Al-Qaeda, isolated and weakened, attempts to bolster its image by forming an alliance with Zarqawi's group, which becomes known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But in 2006, Iraq's Sunnis rise up against Zarqawi, and the US kills him in an airstrike. Over the next few years, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is largely defeated. The Americans withdraw in 2011 from an Iraq that finally looks stable. 2011, the Arab Spring spreads across the Middle East. In Syria, dictator Bashar al-Assad cracks down violently on protesters. They eventually fire back, leading to a civil war. Assad fears the world will intervene against him, so he releases jihadists in large numbers from Syrian prisons, tinging the rebels with extremism and making it harder for foreigners to back them. Back in Iraq, what little remains of Zarqawi's group is still allied with Al-Qaeda, but now known as the Islamic State in Iraq. It's led by a bookish religious scholar who calls himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
The leader took control of the group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Taking advantage of the power vacuum left by the complete U.S. withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 and the Syrian civil war that began that same year, Baghdadi and his lieutenants greatly expanded the size and scope of the organization. At first, Baghdadi was loyal to al-Qaeda's senior leadership, but in 2013 he defied orders from his superiors and declared that his group was now the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Levant, known by its acronyms ISIS and ISIL. It's worth noting that ISIS continues to market Osama bin Laden's endorsement of them to this day.
In 2014, ISIS has built an army in Syria, and it launches a military-style invasion into Iraq. The Iraqi army, weakened by corruption, folds with little fight, and many Sunnis are tired of their Shia-dominated and increasingly authoritarian government, and welcome, or at least tolerate, ISIS's arrival. Within days, ISIS controls a third of Iraq and a big part of Syria. ISIS goal is more audacious than anything imagined by Al-Qaeda: to revive the ancient caliphate and expand it to encompass all Muslims. It earnestly believes its holy war will then bring about the apocalypse as foretold in Scripture. Thousands of Muslims, mostly from the Middle East and from Europe, flock to join the group. Some join for religious reasons, but many are just disillusioned or angry and feel that ISIS offers them answers and
What
a
does
purpose.
ISIS want and why? ISIS is attempting to resurrect an empire similar to those that arose in Islam's early history. These empires were referred to as caliphates and led by a caliph, the Muslims' chief ruler, also known as the Emir of the Faithful. This is, in fact, how Baghdadi's followers now refer to him. ISIS relies on a rich Islamic mythology, with citations from Islamic texts, to justify its actions and portray itself as the true heirs of Muhammad. Their propaganda videos use Islam's early history to frame their actions as part of an ongoing conflict with the Crusaders. ISIS's leaders want their followers to believe they are fighting as part of the same religious war. When ISIS's Libyan branch executed 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians in 2015, ISIS advertised the slayings in a video titled "A Message Signed with Blood to the Nation of the Cross." The Nation of the Cross, of course, meaning Christians. That's why on Libya's Mediterranean shores, the lead executioner of the Egyptian Coptic Christians pointed his knife in the direction of Italy and promised to conquer Rome, the symbolic seat of Christendom. Despite seeking to spark an interfaith war, however, most of ISIS's victims are Muslims, especially Shiite Muslims for whom ISIS, which is Sunni Muslim, harbors a special animosity. ISIS claims that any Muslim who does not swear bay'ah, an oath of allegiance, to Baghdadi is an infidel or an apostate. Even ISIS's rival jihadists and Al-Qaeda are considered apostates because they refuse to genuflect to Baghdadi. In November 2014, Baghdadi announced that his caliphate had expanded into several areas outside of Iraq and Syria. Baghdadi's people set up provinces everywhere from West and North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula to South Asia. ISIS argues that Muslims owe these provinces their loyalty. Most of these provinces control little territory, but they have become prolific killers. Just over 1 year after Baghdadi's announcement, the Islamic State's provinces had already engaged in hundreds of terrorist attacks. On October 31, 2015, for example, the Islamic State's province in Sinai brought down a Russian airliner, killing all 224 people on
launching
board.
increasingly spectacular terror attacks abroad in Tunisia, Kuwait, Sinai, and then Paris. And so-called lone wolves, inspired by ISIS propaganda, also launch attacks, though they're often amateur.
In sum, ISIS is attempting to become a permanent totalitarian state, inspired by the caliphates of Islam's first decades. From this base, they will spread their ideology to the rest of the world. Anyone who stands in the way is marked for death. But ISIS's caliphate claim rests on its ability to control territory. This is both its strength and Achilles' heel. Should it lose significant ground in Iraq and Syria, its caliphate claim will become tenuous, severely damaging its legitimacy in the eyes of many Muslims. How this might happen is a key question, but this much we know: it will take much more than airstrikes. I'm Tom Jocelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies for Prager University.